Hello everybody, thanks very much for tuning in to my first lecture in the series. This one's entitled Are You Interpellated? All the lectures will be taking place in the Freud Disco Study, as you can see behind me, and I will be accompanied by a hat. I have a vast selection of hats, I don't know, maybe 20 or 30 or even more, and I plan to introduce you to a new one every lecture. This hat goes back to the 1990s, that might not surprise you. It's quite a bold hat and kind of looks like it might have belonged to a religious cleric during the Reformation or something. In the 1990s this was a relatively normal hat. Now it seems like quite loud, and to be honest I haven't worn it since the 1990s, even though I love wearing hats. So I've brought it out especially for you today. Before I start the lecture and tell you what it's going to be about, I just want to let you know that there is a competition at the end of the film. It obviously encourages you to watch the whole lecture. You need to probably watch all of it to get the clue. The clue is a indirect reference to popular culture. I will be mentioning popular culture directly to provide examples during the lecture itself, but there is one that's kind of snuck in and I don't explicitly make reference to it or explain what it is. I'll just give you a clue. It is a music reference, and at the end of the lecture you can see how you can enter the competition and you can win a psychogeography zine if you do that. So this lecture is on the concept of interpellation, in particular as discussed by Louis Althusser in an essay which I'll tell you about in a moment, which you can see. Don't you read it in this book? It's from Lenin and Philosophy and Other Essays. I'm just going to take you to the slide now which covers what we're going to look at in the lecture. Louis Althusser is known as a Neomarxist, and what Neomarxists do is take Marx's work and rework it, quite often in the context that they're living in at that time. So they're influenced by the social and political and cultural moment, and they rework his theories to suit what's going on at that time. He's also known as a structuralist. And what structuralists do is look at overarching structures which influence people via culture. They can be things such as language, but you'll see in the example we're going to be looking at today, in relation to interpellation, this is through ideology and the state apparatuses. I first came across Louis Althusser when I was an undergraduate student studying cultural studies, and every week of the first semester in the first year we looked at different theorists, and at the end of that semester we had to do a presentation, and I chose to do mine on Louis Althusser and on this particular essay which I'm going to talk to you about. And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to show you the first slide that I used for my presentation. So that was the first slide for my presentation when I was an undergraduate student doing cultural studies, and that is a music reference. I won't go into any more detail about that. So the essay we're going to look at today is called Ideology and the Ideological State Apparatuses. And there's two terms there that we need to look at before we start looking at interpellation, and that is ideology and state apparatuses. So what we're going to do first of all is look at the state apparatuses. There's two particular types of state apparatuses for Althusser. There's the repressive and the ideological, and it's the ideological one that he's particularly interested in the example of interpellation. He has different categories for both these two types of state apparatuses, and he defines them in different ways. But he does explain that there are kind of blurred boundaries between them. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to put up the slide for that, because you can then rewind the film and refer back to the slide, and then I'll talk you through what's on that slide a little bit further. So you saw the list there of what comes under repressive and what comes under ideological. And just to reiterate, under repressive comes the government, the administration, the army, the police, the courts and prisons, etc. And what Althusser says about these is that they operate ultimately through violence, and he puts that in scare quotes because he doesn't necessarily mean that governments and prisons, etc., are violent, but ultimately there can be things like incarceration that are applied to individuals, and so he uses that term loosely to kind of explain that kind of thing, where when we start looking at the ideological state apparatuses, they operate through ideology. But I will kind of show you sort of the blurred boundaries between the two. So the ideological state apparatuses, I'll just go through the ones that he lists here: religious, educational, the family, and I'll talk more about the family, legal, political. He's given, I don't know why he's given trade unions as sort of a separate one, but he has. And communications, he gives examples of the press, radio and television. Obviously we have the internet now, which wasn't around when Althusser was writing this, which is sort of, I think it was 1968 the French version came out. And then he's put culture, and he's listed next to that literature, art, sports, etc. I myself would also kind of add health to that one. I would say that kind of is more important in a way than the trade unions, in as much as I think it is ideological, and also I would give you an example of how these two, the repressive and the ideological one, can interact with each other. And an example would be if we're looking at, say, health as an ideological state apparatus alongside something like education, perhaps, as a public service. Courts can get involved with individuals when individuals are sectioned under the Mental Health Act, and then you can see how when you become incarcerated, which you are if you're sectioned, your liberty is taken away. That would be an example of how Althusser would describe as sort of violence, but it doesn't mean it's violence against the body. It means often that your will and what you might consider to be your rights as an individual are changed. He also says that even the ideological state apparatuses uses forms of repression, and even the repressive state apparatuses use forms of ideology, but they are predominantly one or the other. He also gives an example of public and private as ways of differentiating the two. So he says the repressive state apparatus is public, but he means in a sense that it's kind of a public body such that it kind of belongs to the state. So we have to be careful we don't kind of muddle up public and private, for example, within something like education, because education is still ideological, whether it's in a private school or it's a public government-led school, especially at this time in Britain where the academies are changing the whole landscape when it comes to education. So we have to be a little bit careful about public and private, how he uses it here. My way of describing it would be that the private domain in relation to ideological state apparatuses are ones that kind of influence home life. So if you think of it more in that sense, so for example, like communications and culture and education are more related to private life, and the public repressive state apparatuses are more related to kind of, probably you could say, civic life, although that's probably not the best term to use. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is I want to give you an example of ideology. And we all use the term ideology all the time, especially at the moment when we're talking about, in Britain anyway, Brexit and Remain, and the two opposing camps always accuse the other one of using propaganda and being ideological, which is kind of interesting. So we use this term ideology all the time without necessarily clarifying exactly what we mean by it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to read you out a quote by Althusser. It's not from the essay that we're looking at today, it's from his book For Marx, and he uses terms that I think are important to Althusser's own work. He kind of uses psychoanalytical terms, or Freudian terms if you want to call them that, because he is influenced very heavily by Freud as well. And so this is a quote from For Marx, and it is, there are actually some ellipses in here, but I'm not going to pause where they are, I'm just going to run it through all together. Ideology is profoundly unconscious, and he's put unconscious in italics here. And you'll see when I talk further about interpellation how this unconscious element operates. He goes on to say, is the system of representation, but in the majority of cases these representations have nothing to do with consciousness. They are usually images and occasionally concepts, that is above all as structures that they impose on the vast majority of men. I apologise that he doesn't use women or others, not via their consciousness. They are, this is interesting, he's put perceived, accepted, suffered altogether with hyphens. They are perceived, accepted, suffered, cultural objects, and they act functionally on men via a process that escapes them. So, how does this occur? So now we've looked at the sort of basic terms we need to look at, ideology and the state apparatuses. We're going to go on to interpellation now. This particular part I'm going to read from now comes from a section in this essay called Ideology Interpellates Individuals as Subjects. So if you have that essay already, this is where you'll find the next two extracts that I'm going to read from. I'm going to read you a kind of a really good sort of, it's not an anecdote, but a good everyday kind of example to show you how this kind of idea of structuralism is an everyday occurrence that happens, as Althusser mentioned in the last quote I read out to you, sort of unconsciously. There are kind of a few other terms I'd like to introduce you to now, so that you can kind of pick up on them, and they relate directly to interpellation, and they are things like practices, structures, we've used that already, obviousness, which I'll go back to, and recognition. And they're all important terms in relation to the next two examples I'm going to give you, and in a moment an example I'm going to give you which relates to popular culture. So the first example he gives us here is how it is for us when we kind of meet someone we know. And he says, and this is also an important word, he says to take a highly concrete example, and he's put concrete in scare quotes, and what he means by concrete is kind of material. So all these interpellations, and I'm going to give you an example of interpellation now, take place in sort of real space. There are spaces that are kind of culturally oriented, that make these practices apply in that particular setting. So, oh, by the way, never get this version of this book. Honestly, the pages just fall out. To take a highly concrete in scare quotes, example, we all have friends who, when they knock on our door and we ask through the door the question, "Who's there?" Answer, since it's obvious, "It's me." And we recognise that it is him or her. We open the door and it's true, it really was she who was there. To take another example, when we recognise somebody of our previous acquaintance in the street, we show him that we have recognised him and have recognised that he has recognised us by saying to him, "Hello, my friend," and shaking his hand. A material ritual practice of ideological recognition in everyday life. In France at least, elsewhere there are other rituals. So some of those terms I mentioned then that are important to this concept of interpellation came up there. Practices, so he said it's a material ritual practice of ideological recognition in everyday life. That's the kind of most important thing about interpellation. So, and in this example you can see it's kind of a mutual one. Excuse me. Right, so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to show you, this is his famous example, and I kind of love this example. In a way, it's kind of quaint. He was writing in the late 60s. This essay came out in 1968 in France, and 71, I think it was, in the translated version in English. And for any of you who are, I don't know, maybe in their 40s and 50s, you'll remember a time when, certainly in Britain, we had what we called bobbies on the beat. So policemen were commonplace, especially if you kind of lived in a village. He'd probably cycle around and everyone would say hello to him, him/her. And so I kind of find this example is kind of quaint in a way, because it seems like it does represent the past. Not that there aren't policemen in the street anymore, but just not in the same way that there would have been probably in France as there was in England as well. So while the example he gives us doesn't mean it couldn't happen today, and I'm sure you'll understand it from a personal perspective, this particular example, if it happened to yourself, I kind of find it is slightly, it kind of is a little bit of a quaint example. But this is a really, this is his famous example, and I love it. I think it's just really, really cleverly written. So he says, ideology acts or functions in such a way that it recruits subjects among the individuals. And he puts recruits in scare quotes. He uses a lot of scare quotes. In such a way that it recruits subjects among the individuals. In brackets, it recruits them all, or transforms, scare quotes again, the individuals into subjects. It transforms them all. By that very precise operation, which I have called interpellation or hailing, we saw in the previous example it was kind of a recognition. I've called interpellation or hailing, and which can be imagined along the lines of the most commonplace everyday police or other hailing. "Hey, you there!" Assuming that the theoretical scene I've imagined takes place in the street, the hailed individual will turn around. By this mere 180-degree physical conversion, he becomes a subject. Why? Because he has recognised that the hail was really addressed to him, and that it was really him who was hailed and not someone else. Experience shows that the practical telecommunication of hailings is such that they hardly ever miss their man. Verbal, call or whistle, the one hailed always recognises that it is really him who is being hailed. And yet it is a strange phenomenon, and one which cannot be explained solely by guilt feelings, despite the large numbers who have something on their consciences. So the slide I just put up there was a screenshot from Minority Report, the film, and I'm providing that as an example of popular culture and how this, I don't know if you've seen the film itself, but the character played by Tom Cruise is, I think his name's John Anderton, or Adderton, maybe Anderton, and when I think he's walking to work in this particular clip, but the adverts are tailored specifically for him and even address him directly. So this is a perfect example of what was at the time kind of futuristic interpellation, this kind of personalised advertising, which really is it's not even new anymore. We have it all the time on our Facebook feed, don't we? This kind of personalised advertising. So as you can see, it's incorporated into daily life, interpellation, such that we don't even really notice it. And this is the term obviousness. It's this obviousness that makes us unaware of it. And it's its obviousness that makes it operate on our unconsciousness, rather than us thinking, oh look, there's an advert for me there, it's ideological, it's not natural at all. But we're made to kind of think it is. It almost appears like it's natural. And that's kind of how it functions in a way. It functions to the extent where it seems like it's a natural course of things, it's normal, and it's never been any other way. So, I mean, I know we don't quite have personal advertising in the street now in the way that we do in Minority Report, but we do have advertising in the street. We have billboards. You could be driving around the ring road in your city, and there's a big billboard there, and it looks like it's been kind of put there for you because you make some kind of psychological connection to it for some reason. And the same way as if you're walking in your high street, you might see one of the posters on a bus stop, and it has the same kind of effect. Now, I'd kind of like to give you some examples of how we might challenge these kinds of things. One of the items on the agenda was, can we kind of challenge interpellation? Can we not be interpellated? Well, obviously the questioning of what we seem to think is the kind of natural order of things is a way of challenging it. That could be as basic as questioning why we have the name we do. You know, a really good example of structuralism is how we are born into a family name. And actually it's an example that Althusser gives us. He says that we're already interpellated even before we are physically born. We're just a fetus in the womb, and we're going to be born into this structure which is going to be the culture that we're born into, but we're also going to be born with a surname which is going to be given to us. So in that sense, even before our birth, we are interpellated. There are kind of challenges to structural theory. It won't surprise you to know it's called post-structural theory, and I'll give you some suggested readings and go on to that in a moment. But I'd like to give you an example from my own field, and I'm actually a psychogeographer, and what psychogeographers do are they kind of walk in urban space, in particular in cities, and kind of question the way the terrain looks, because one clever thing about urban space is it sort of works in a similar way to interpellation, in such that you are made to behave in a certain way in urban space, and you're kind of like expected to walk down certain paths, and you don't question those things, you just kind of follow. Sorry, that's my 11 o'clock bird chirping. Sorry, I'll just have a sip of coffee while we let that go. Okay, and psychogeographers question those things. So we question the structure of urban space. We also investigate how people feel about it, so the affective response that individuals have to being in the city or walking around urban space, and the aesthetics, how it looks and whether people kind of like something or don't like it. But one thing we're particularly interested in is kind of how we're limited in urban space to behave in a certain way, and it might be to do with how the urban decor is placed, but it might be something not so obvious. It's just the way that the that cities are designed to kind of make you flow in a certain direction. For example, in the high street, you are encouraged to consume, in other words, purchase. You're not really encouraged to do anything else. You wouldn't be allowed to play ball games in your high street, for instance. You're there to either browse, window shop, but really you're there to buy. So as a psychogeographer, we like to look at how to kind of challenge that. So what I'm going to do in a moment is I'm going to give you a reading list, but before I do that, I'd like to talk to you about a particular post-structuralist who I think is good to kind of set, I don't like to use the word set against Althusser, but he's someone who's very good at explaining that you don't have to sort of behave or think in this kind of within this structure. You're not fixed within this structure. There are other ways of being or thinking, and ultimately everybody brings their individual self to the table. His name is Roland Barthes. Can you see that? It's Mythologies, Roland Barthes. It will come up on the next slide. And he's very eloquent at talking about how we all kind of respond to, for example, he looks at literature and how we all respond to it on an individual level. And this book is really, really great. I absolutely love it. He analyses popular culture, but there's also just a really brilliant essay in there called Myth Today, which I'd recommend. He looks at things like, I'll give you some of the headings here, soap powders and detergents, steak and chips, and striptease. So this is just a brilliant book and an example of post-structuralism. So I'm just going to give you the slide now for the suggested reading. That's the end of my lecture. Thanks very much for tuning in. Just to let you know, the next slide, the sort of final slide, is the competition. So, like I said, I made one indirect reference to popular culture, which you will need to tell me what it is. I did give a hint at the time, and it was a music-related one. And the competition, you will win this. I don't think you can see it very well. Oh, there it is. Sorry, it's overexposed here. It's a psychogeography zine. It looks at the city, urban aesthetics, etc. And it is on a course at Bowling Green State University. So just to let you know, it is quite a significant zine. So I'd like you to let me know if you like the lecture. You can do that by writing in the comments underneath the film, and you can do that by contacting me on my website, which is www.schizocartography.org. It appears on the slides, the web address does. And then if you did like the lecture and you want to come back to the Freud Disco Study for something further, I'm kind of thinking that maybe it might be nice to do a Roland Barthes one for the next lecture, since I've mentioned that in this one. And then of course the most important thing is you'll get to see more hats. Thanks very much.